Hello, my name is Eric Hahn, and welcome to Shit I Have to Teach in 20 Minutes, a podcast for history teachers and anyone who wants a quick dose of history. This podcast now has listeners in 284 cities around the world. We continue our thanks and hope information shared on this podcast promotes worthwhile discussions and thinking. In each recording, my colleague Rob Good and I interview a historian about their scholarship. We ask them to identify the most important concepts they think teachers should share with their students about the topic for the day. We also include a free lesson plan, almost always two, and in fact, it's always been two up to this point, 2 lessons that can be downloaded from the episode notes linked to this podcast. So Rob, what is our topic for today?
Eric, today we're examining how to teach about American Indian people in a U.S. survey course. Unfortunately, many textbooks and curricula present a two-dimensional depiction of American Indian people and nations, portraying them as objects upon which European colonialism was unleashed. While the brutalities of settler colonialism must be taught, there is often little attention to the agency, resourcefulness, and goals of various Native American people and nations who encountered those settlers. Furthermore, the history of Indian people often fades from the curricula following the massacre at Wounded Knee, contributing to the myth of the disappearing Indian, which can result in the erasure of Indigenous history during the 20th and early 21st centuries.
Interesting, very interesting. And it seems that there's still a lot of holdover. There are still a lot of holdover impressions about Native Americans based upon what people have seen or heard in media. I'm very curious about how perspectives in teaching the history of American Indians has changed and how perspectives in research have changed too. So who is our guest today, Rob?
Today, we welcome Dr. Philip Deloria, one of our nation's leading scholars in the history of American Indian people. He's the Leverett Salenstall Professor of History at Harvard University. As an American Studies scholar, he brings a wide array of cultural, social, and political evidence to his work. For instance, his book, Indians in Unexpected Places, examines how the experiences of Indian people in film, sports, technology, and music challenge traditional ideologies and representations of their lives. I'm sure many of our listeners are probably familiar with Phil through his recent appearances on Ken Burns' documentary series, The American Revolution, and we are extremely fortunate to have him with us today.
That is exciting news, Rob. Phil, I'm very excited. I watched you and each entire episode of The Revolution. I could go on and on about your great work in the series, but we want to hear from you. Phil, thanks for joining us today. Then my question to you is, what would you say are the most important concepts that teachers should teach and students should know regarding the history of the American Indian people?
Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Rob, so much for having me. I'm going to start with a list of 3 things and then take the last point and subdivide it down and talk about some concrete historical things. So the first of these 3 points is simply what Native people say all the time, which is, we are still here. And Native people say that because the erasure of Native people from American history and American culture is just so ongoing. So it's important for students and teachers to know there are 574 federally recognized tribes. There are many state recognized tribes. And that if you go back to, Rob, as you mentioned, sort of the Wounded Knee massacre in 1890, the population of Native people in the 1900 census is about 250,000. Now, today, there's over 9 million Native people in the census that, the most recent censuses. And so Native people have actually been growing in population, not shrinking and not disappearing. So that's the first point. The second point is that Native people are not like the other kids, on the block, which is to say, it's oftentimes the case that American Indians get lumped into the kind of classic ethnic studies sort of framework with African Americans, with Latino, Latinx, Asian Americans. And the assumption then is that what Native people are after is an American civil rights paradigm where make me visible to the state that allows me to claim a certain set of rights under the rubric of the state. It's about being integrated. But Native people really operate in a different logic, and that's the logic of treaties. And so treaties put Native people in a very different kind of place. What Native people have oftentimes asked for is a nation-to-nation relationship with the United States. So the United States has not been all that keen on having that kind of relationship. But the outcome of this has been an absolutely fundamentally unique political structure, which is to say we have a federal structure, we have a state structure, we have local and municipal kinds of structures of government, and we also have tribal government. And tribal government really represents a fourth kind of way within the American political system. And so, in that sense, Native people are and should be seen as a political group more than as a racial or ethnically defined kind of group. So, that's the second point. Then the third point is really that Native people are actually everywhere in American history. And if one tries, it's not that hard to actually integrate Native people. If we think, for example, about military history, we can point to the ways that so much of the sort of military history of the United States involves conflicts with Native people or in conflicts with other nations or European empires, Native people playing a fundamental role. This is one of the things that's been fun about the Ken Burns American Revolution series. It's been to sort of kind of, think with the Ken Burns team in terms of placing Native people within the history of the American Revolution. But the Civil War, and I'll say a word or two more about that, is a great place to talk about Native history. Reconstruction, there's a Native Reconstruction, there's a Native Progressive Era, there is an Indian New Deal, quite literally an Indian New Deal. There's a Native Cold War, the history of the 60s and 70s. So everywhere across the full range of American history, you can find Native people. So within that third point, then, I thought I would pull out a couple of different moments or cases that I think are really interesting and that are really being pushed forward in the scholarship today. So the first is the idea of the Bering Straits theory. So when I went through school, I was still taught that Indian people crossed over the land bridge and the frozen stuff around 13,000 years ago, and that they took out the mammoths and the mastodons and the Pleistocene megafauna and things like that. Now, the problem with that theory is that if you find any evidence of Native people existing in North America prior to that, it kind of blows the theory up. And so people defended that theory for many, many years, and it has become basically indefensible these days. We found archaeological things that push us back to 16,000 years ago, 1605, even 20,000 years, perhaps. And some of these things are in South America, which suggests whole new stories that we just don't really know about how Native people got to this continent. But it is really interesting to think then that, for example, if we're talking about environmental adaptation, Native people seem to have been able to live with mammoths and mastodons for thousands and thousands of years before those animals went extinct on the continent. So it probably has something more to do with climate change and a multi-factor kind of causal thing that's going on. So there's one thing that I think is really quite important. A second thing is really the ways that we've been really rethinking unfreedom and slavery, drawing on the works of scholars like Andres Resendes, Brent Rushforth, Christina Snyder, Margaret Newell, Lynn Fisher. That slavery, if we think about, I think the North American continent is like the most enslaved place, the most diversely enslaved place in the history of the world. So if we think that, yes, we have these native forms of unfreedom that are indigenous literally to this continent, that collide with European forms of unfreedom, that collide with African forms, and that take shape around sort of the Atlantic sort of slave trade that really, unfolds. If we integrate a full continental vision of this, we can see all kinds of interesting things happening, including sort of the beginnings where basically the Spanish inaugurate what I think we can call, honestly, a genocidal death slavery, literally capturing and working people to death. And we'll see that later on in California, in the wake of the gold rush. We'll also see a lot of indigenous slave raiding and trading that goes on. So people from the Great Lakes and the Northern Great Plains will take people from the heart of the continent as captives and trade them through a French system and swap them down into the Caribbean. If we think about every American colonial war on the Atlantic coast, it's oftentimes also a slave raid, right, that takes indigenous people, into captivity. And a lot of that is focused on women and children. So it's a different form of slavery. As Andres Resendes pointed out, in the Spanish Empire, slavery was in theory illegal. And so it was off the books. And so it's actually harder to trace. So we can think about those things as being part and parcel of a larger and more expanded story about unfreedom. Then the third thing to think about is the nature of land and wealth. And for me, this goes to the question of what some scholars have called like the big 1862. So when we're teaching 1862 and the Homestead Act, for example, if we think about the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railway Act, and the Morrill Act, all passed within a few months in 1862, all of these things rely upon Indian land, and they are basically transfers of Indian land into the General Land Office and then to corporations in the form of railroads, private citizens in the form of the Homestead Act, right? And land grant universities in the form of the Morrill Act. And so that moment of American development, that crucial Civil War moment, is completely wrapped up with Indian land. And I think a great way to think about this as a lesson in a class would be to go to the Land Grab University's website, which allows you to see which universities really feasted on native land. Calling you out, Cornell University, and other kinds of places. But I think it could be fun, right, to trace like where your local land grant institution actually got some of its, sort of foundational money. The University of California system seems to have run off Indian land money in its early years of operation. So it's another thing to think about. And then some of the recent scholarship around what Emily Connolly, a fabulous scholar, has called the fiduciary colonialism, really forces us to reevaluate some of the ways we think about treaties in which Native people, in the beginning, exchanged land for money. And the money that they wanted was like wagon loads of gold and silver. And what Connolly points out, is that after a while, the United States stopped doing that. And instead, they set up big lumps of capital in the treasury. And then they paid annuities to tribes off of the interest of that lump of capital. But then that lump of capital becomes really a capital stack that allows the United States to develop railroads and canals and infrastructure. So when we think about the ways the United States has actually consolidated its wealth, we talk a lot about the wealth of slavery, and that's absolutely and fundamentally critical. But the wealth in Indian land is like massive. It's one of the things that really allows us to think hard about sort of the financial sort of origins of the United States. And that might point us to sort of a rethinking of the Civil War and Reconstruction. So, we focus on the Civil War as a kind of North-South sort of conflict. But if you add up what's happening, the big 1862 with all the financial stuff that's going on, and then you think about the violence. So in 1862, there's incredible violence against Native people in California, which is an ongoing thing, but also the Minnesota Uprising, which then leads to what is essentially the ethnic cleansing of northern Minnesota, North Dakota, the northern plains. 1863, that's continuing. My own ancestor, Alfred Sully, is attacking Dakota people at Whitestone Hill in 1863 and into 1864. 1863, the massacre of Shoshone people at Bear River. Continued violence in California. Kit Carson going after the Navajos in a sort of scorched earth campaign that will result in 1864 in the Navajo Long Walk. Also in 1864, continuing on the northern plains, but also the massacre of Native people of Cheyennes and Arapahoes at Sand Creek. We'll add up all of that, right, and map it, those violent conflicts. And what you can see is that the Civil War is a continental kind of struggle, right? And it's not just a few sort of Confederate incursions into New Mexico and the Union beating them back and things like that. It is a struggle about the future of the country in the form of the West, and that is totally based on native land. So those are a few things that I think, offer opportunities for diving into the classic American narratives. And I'll just say one more thing. The students I confront, or not confront, I have the joy of teaching them, oftentimes will come out of their high school experience saying, like, you can't say the word Indian, right? And it's like, well, actually, most Native people at one time or another say the word Indian, right? And, have sort of adopted it and made it their own. There's lots of critiques of it, but you can think about things like the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, right? All sorts of the National Congress of American Indians, many, many moments. So I think my final piece of advice, or at least, kind of in this initial round, is it's not worth wasting our time and energy, right? Getting folks riled up about what we're using in terms of terminology in the ways that I think I've seen over the last few years. Native American is good. Native sometimes is good. Indigenous refers to kind of a larger, more global way of thinking about it. American Indian is fine. Whenever we're talking about specific tribes, we should use specific tribal names. If the tribal language is available to us, we should use that. So we might say Lakota, we might say Sioux, or we might say Ocheti Shakowin, right? All those things are good. They're all possible and all doable. So those are a few of my thoughts, and maybe we continue the conversation.
Wow, that's a whole lot. And that last piece will be very helpful for teachers who struggle. Even Eric and I were talking about, and I think I asked you, how would you like me to frame this conversation? Because I think that's a concern that people have. So I really appreciate the depth of where the fact that the story of American Indian people is interlaced completely through all of this. And you gave a lot of examples from the 15th century through the 19th century. A question that I have, because I really appreciated what you said about that this is a political story, and that the experience, that third point, that we're not like other folks, that we have sovereignty issues and treaty issues. In looking at the 20th century, because this is where in my own teaching practice, I think I really struggled. Would you suggest to teachers, well, I mean, I think you can do both, look at the political issues, whether it be the Citizens Act of 24 or the Indian Reorganization Act of 34 or termination in the 50s, those political issues. But what really draws me to your work is the cultural pieces and the issues of representation that sort of are, as you say, in unexpected, Indians in unexpected places. It's those anomalies, those encounters that we have that force us out of the expectations that, I'm a white dude bringing expectations to this, and that many of my students are bringing, whether they're white, whether they're Black, whether they're Latina, they are bringing different expectations to the Indian experience. And so do you also suggest layering in some of that cultural history, and particularly in the 20th century, because I think that's where the story gets lost. Maybe somebody comes back to AIM, in the 60s, but there's a whole missed part.
Yeah, I mean, the 20th century is so fantastic and fabulous. I mean, one of the things a great entry point is the quarterly journal of the Society of American Indians, and thinking about, like, first of all, just Native people being funny, being humorous, right? So, they meet on Columbus Day in Columbus, Ohio, right? Now, if that's not a statement, I don't know what is. But what's cool about it is, like, you go and you can look at the pictures that the women are wearing these fabulous hats. The men are ministers and they're in suits and they fan out to preach and, in the city, and, and they're fabulous writers. And they advance this really complicated set of of stories. And if we think about those folks, for example, as cultural and political actors, not just political actors, right, but cultural and political actors, it opens up all sorts of opportunities. I mean, Rob, in some ways, this book, Indians in Unexpected Places, I think opens up a whole range of possibilities for teachers, as well. I mean, I started this book by thinking about my grandfather as a Native American athlete, an honorable mention, All-American, 1922. And, the sort of ways in which everybody just said, I know an Indian athlete, Jim Thorpe. And then, I'd say, well, tell me another one. And every now and then someone would say, oh, what about Chief Bender, the baseball pitcher, right? And then from there, but basically, the argument of that book is, like, there are hundreds and hundreds of Native athletes. And if you take them seriously and sort of trace them and track them, and these days, it's not that hard to find some of these people, they show up in all sorts of places, local historical societies. You just Google Indian athletes and suddenly you could imagine an assignment that sends you on some biographical kinds of expeditions, going out and looking at some of these Native athletes. Well, for me in that book, I sprung from my grandfather then to think about all kinds of other Native people active in the cultural realm in the 20th century, musicians and performers and singers and people who got a little bit of money and bought a car, and what were they doing with a car, and didn't that freak out, their white neighbors, and the performers in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And, lately I've been writing about artists, my great aunt as an artist. So if we sort of imagine, looking at the broad range of the cultural realm, writing, art, dance, music, you can find Native people in every one of those cultural sorts of arenas. And their stories are fantastic, and really super interesting. There are places where you can go and find fabulous primary sources, So that's all part and parcel of, what's possible here. I should also say, if we think back to the late 19th century, we think about teaching Reconstruction. Well, there's been so much attention to Indian boarding schools, lately. And that's part of a doubled kind of story of Reconstruction, right? The Reconstruction of the South, but also the Reconstruction of Indian people in the West, right? Through the practices of land allotment and boarding school education. One of the things I do with my students that's really fun is to send them to the Carlisle Indian School website, which has all sorts of fabulous primary sources. And, sort of asks students to think like, well, what would you do with this? Would you turn this into a quantitative kind of project and find out, well, how many Native folks from Alaska are at Carlisle? It turns out there's a lot. Why is that? Turns out there's a familial connection to this guy, Sheldon Jackson, up in Alaska. So you can imagine that kind of thing, or you can imagine deep dives into the publications, and then I think that invites us to think, well, okay, this is a late 19th, early 20th century sort of educational institution. What if we were to trace some of the names of the people who passed through here? Many of these folks die, many of these people disappear from the record, but a lot of them don't, right? The Carlisle cohorts actually are really interesting and important people across the range of the 20th century. So maybe we trace a few people, kind of collectively as a bit of a project. You can imagine something like that.
I love that idea as a lesson, Phil. I really do. And I also would encourage teachers to find out a little bit more about some of the origins. You talked about the land bridge and 13,000 years, Clovis points being kind of scattered around and uses dating methods. That's right. I know that's the textbook I use. So sorry, former students. And but getting to that Carlisle website, my big question to you is: do you have maybe one or two more resources that you would recommend for teachers who maybe want to know a little bit more about American Indian history? What would you say is a good access?
Well, a great go-to is the National Museum of the American Indian, which has a project called Native Knowledge 360. And they have a bunch of lesson plans that are very well written, well researched, historically accurate, reliable, right? You don't have to actually worry about those things because they really have been quite well vetted. So that's, I think, a great go-to place to start. I'll just mention two websites that have just come online lately that deal with the question of indigenous slavery that I mentioned earlier. One's called Stolen Relations. Lynn Fisher at Brown has put that together. And the other is called Native Bound Unbound. Esteban Real Galvez has put that together out of New Mexico. And they're both sort of trying to trace in the historical record with links to primary sources, these questions about Native people who find themselves pulled into enslavement, and so in terms of sort of following, like saying like, let's trace some of these primary sources and what they can tell us. And sometimes these things are not that helpful, right? It's a newspaper advertisement that says enslaved person has run away. But in other cases, right, both of these sites have really interesting things that take you deeper into the question.
Boy, and we will definitely put links to those for those of you listening in the episode notes that you can find them. And I think the true lesson here is there's no excuse not to bring these stories in any part of the U.S. survey class. And there are all these resources and ways to bring this story in. Thank you for opening with those three things that Indians say about the history and the representation within the historical the ways that this is taught. And hopefully we can engage our listeners in bringing more stories to fore. Eric, did you have any last things?
Yes, very impressive talk in such a short time. Remember, you can download your free lesson from the link provided in the episode notes. Be sure to stay tuned after this brief song to hear a description of those lessons.
Oh no, the clock is ticking, 20 minutes, time is spinning, pulling facts from thin air, hope they think I came prepared.
Wow, Phil gave us so much to think about in such a short period of time. The lesson I developed responds to his observations about the erasure of Native American experiences from the traditional U.S. history narrative. In this lesson, students are tasked with writing an addition to their textbook discussing how American Indian people participated in the progressive movement during the early 20th century. They will use several primary sources, including 2 documents from the Quarterly Journal of the Society of American Indians that he referenced as resources for the lesson. The lesson's goal is to help students see both the activism of Indian professionals during the era as well as their unique status as sovereign people who maintained a critical lens about white society and institutions.
Okay. Good luck with that, teachers. It's excellent. And I focused on Phil's notion that we should pay attention to American Indian tribes as nations. So, in taking a sharp look at the Horse Creek Treaty of 1851, I don't know if I'll ever teach Manifest Destiny without covering that episode ever again. Students use the Smithsonian American Indian website that Phil referenced to learn about the consequences of Manifest Destiny on the Plains Indian tribes, where more than 10,000, some cases, some resources say 15,000 American Indians attended the signing of this historically important moment. See the lesson from the website to find out what happens.
That's great. Well, thank you all for listening. And remember, you can download the free lessons from the link provided in the episode notes. And please be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts and on Instagram and YouTube. Eric will tell you how.
You can reach us for any feedback, questions, or suggestions you might have about the conversations or lessons at historyin20@gmail.com. History in 20 is all spelled out as one word. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for joining us today.